A stormy island, 10 strangers, one nursery rhyme, and no escape. What happens when guilt turns deadly? The wind howled like a restless beast, slamming against the windows of a grand, ancient mansion perched on the edge of an isolated island. Thunder growled ominously in the distance, and the heavy, churning waves crashed against jagged rocks, making escape seem impossible. A group of 10 strangers arrived one by one, each soaked from the relentless rain, clutching invitations promising an exclusive retreat, a luxurious getaway they couldn't resist. Each guest was different: a wealthy business tycoon with a sharp gaze, a quiet schoolteacher clutching her handbag tightly, a retired army colonel with a stoic demeanor, and others who ranged from glamorous to unassuming. They were strangers to each other, yet each carried a peculiar tension, as if the storm outside had seeped into their souls. No one seemed eager to share why they'd accepted the mysterious invitation. Inside, the dining room was a stark contrast to the chaos outside. Lavishly decorated with crystal chandeliers, polished oak furniture, and a roaring fireplace, it exuded wealth and grandeur. In the center of the long dining table stood 10 eerie figurines, faceless and featureless, carved from cold black stone. Their unsettling stillness seemed to watch over the room. The air grew heavier as they settled into their seats. The absence of the host, a person none of them had ever met, was glaringly obvious. They exchanged polite but uneasy glances, each waiting for someone else to break the silence. Then, the tension was shattered by the sudden screech of hidden speakers crackling to life. "Ladies and gentlemen," a cold, mechanical voice echoed, sharp and precise like a blade cutting through the storm. "You have been invited here not for leisure, but for justice. Each of you is guilty of a crime for which you have never been punished." The room froze. Heartbeats quickened. Someone gasped audibly. "What kind of sick joke is this?" the business tycoon barked, rising from his chair. But the voice continued, unrelenting. "You thought your sins were forgotten. You thought no one would uncover the darkness you hide. Tonight, justice will be served, and none of you will leave this island alive." A thunderclap boomed, as if to punctuate the chilling declaration. Panic erupted. The teacher clutched her chest, her breathing ragged. The colonel's hand instinctively reached for his hip, where a gun should have been. "We need to get out of here," someone shouted. The group bolted for the front door, their footsteps echoing down the long corridor. But when they reached the dock, their last shred of hope vanished. The boat, their only means of escape, was gone, swallowed by the raging storm. As lightning lit up the sky, they turned to face the mansion, its shadow looming like a predator in the night. The faceless figurines on the dining table seemed to mock them, a sinister reminder of the unseen threat that had ensnared them. And then, a single thought clawed its way into every mind. Who among them was the killer? Or worse, was the killer watching them right now? Cliffhanger ending. The storm roared louder, drowning out their frantic cries. As they stood paralyzed by fear, the sound of heavy footsteps echoed faintly behind them. Someone was still inside the house. The setup, the first death. The dining room was no longer the picture of opulence it had been hours earlier. The once elegant table now felt like a battlefield, with the guests seated around it like wary opponents. The accusations from the chilling voice still hung heavy in the air, each word a dagger aimed at their darkest secrets. The storm outside howled relentlessly, a haunting backdrop to their rising dread. No one spoke at first. The silence was suffocating. Faces twitched with poorly concealed fear, and eyes darted suspiciously from one guest to the next. The business tycoon, Mr. Raza, broke the silence with an impatient growl. "This is absurd. Whoever is behind this childish prank better come forward now." "Prank?" snapped Dr. Mira, the reserved psychologist who had thus far observed quietly. "Do you really think this is a prank? Someone knows things about us, things they shouldn't know." Her words were met with murmurs of unease. Alaya, the young schoolteacher, twisted the strap of her handbag nervously. But if this is real, who would do this, and why? Her voice trembled, on the verge of breaking. Maybe the better question, interjected Colonel Farouk, his voice cold and commanding, is which one of us brought this on the rest? His sharp gaze scanned the room, daring anyone to challenge him. Tensions flared as accusations began flying. Voices overlapped, rising in anger and desperation. Fingers were pointed, secrets hinted at but not fully revealed. Underneath it all was a shared fear no one wanted to admit, the possibility that the voice wasn't lying. "Enough," boomed Raza, slamming his fist on the table. "Let's just eat and wait for the storm to pass. Whoever this lunatic is, they can't keep us here forever." Reluctantly, the group sat down to the meal that had been laid out before their arrival, an elaborate feast that now felt like a sinister offering. Plates clinked, and the sound of cutlery scraping against porcelain filled the tense void. No one ate much, the food turning to ash in their mouths. And then it happened. Zahid, a flamboyant travel writer with a sarcastic wit, raised his glass to his lips. To our mysterious host, he quipped with a bitter laugh, "May they choke on their own theatrics." He drank deeply, setting the glass down with a flourish. But before anyone could react, his face contorted in pain. His hand flew to his throat, clawing desperately as his eyes bulged in terror. He gasped, trying to speak, but only a strangled gurgle escaped. "Zahid!" Alaya screamed, leaping to her feet. Zahid collapsed onto the table, knocking over glasses and plates, his body convulsing violently. The room erupted in chaos shouts of panic, chairs scraping against the floor as the guests scrambled away. Mira knelt beside him, checking for a pulse, but the look on her face said it all. He's dead," she whispered, her voice trembling. "What just happened?" shouted Farouk, his hand instinctively reaching for a weapon that wasn't there. "It's poison," Mira said grimly, pointing to the half-empty glass still clutched in Zahid's hand. "Cyanide, from the smell of it." The gravity of her words silenced the room. Slowly, everyone's gaze turned toward the untouched glasses in front of them. The reality sank in like a stone. The killer wasn't just watching, they were among them. As they gathered their wits, someone suggested returning to the dining room to regroup, but when they stepped back into the room, a horrifying discovery awaited them. One of the 10 figurines on the table was missing. In its place, scrawled across the wall in blood-red ink, was the first verse of a sinister nursery rhyme. 10 little strangers sat down to dine. One choked on poison, and then there were 9. A gasp rippled through the group, the eerie rhyme twisting the air like a noose around their throats. Cliffhanger ending. The storm raged louder, rattling the windows as if mocking their terror. "This isn't just murder," Mira said, her voice low and trembling. "This is a game, and we're the pawns." At that moment, the lights flickered violently, plunging the room into darkness. A scream tore through the blackness, cutting through the storm's roar, and the sound of something shattering echoed ominously. Someone whispered, What just happened?" No one dared to move. Rising tension, unraveling secrets. The storm outside had not relented. In fact, it had only intensified, lashing against the windows like the vengeful hand of an unseen force. The wind howled through the cracked panes, and the rain pummeled the roof with such ferocity that it seemed as though the island itself was trying to expel them, urging them into the depths of its treacherous waters. But the guests remained, trapped by fate or something far darker. The shock of Zahid's death still hung in the air, but it had swiftly transformed into a chilling suspicion. No one dared speak of it directly, yet each glance, each movement, seemed loaded with unspoken accusations. In the dimly lit hallway, Colonel Farouk stood, his posture rigid, as he stared out into the storm. "There is something more at play here," he muttered under his breath, a grim expression on his face. His military training kicked in, the need to assess, to strategize. His mind was sharp, but his eyes betrayed his unease. Was he being watched? He couldn't shake the feeling of invisible eyes on him at all times. Around him the others were scattered, some huddled in corners whispering amongst themselves, others trying to act normal, as though pretending everything was fine might somehow shield them from the inevitable next step in the twisted game they were now part of. Dr. Mira sat by the fire, her face pale, deep lines of worry etched into her forehead. She had once prided herself on her ability to read people, to understand what lay beneath the surface. Yet here she found herself struggling to make sense of the game's rules, her professional calm faltering under the weight of a nightmare she couldn't rationalize. "Who could be doing this?" Alaya whispered from across the room, her voice quivering. Her hands were clasped tightly around her glass, knuckles white. "The storm. The boat. Where's the host? Are they watching us?" No one answered, the question lingering like a dark cloud. But the silence wasn't comforting, it was oppressive, as if something unseen was lurking just beyond the edge of their perception, waiting to strike. The night dragged on with no answers. Sleep was a luxury none of them could afford, their minds whirring, filled with paranoia and dread. It was only when the first light of dawn broke through the curtains that they dared to venture out, though none of them felt truly safe. But what they found in the morning light was far worse than the storm they had hoped would pass. Samar, the lawyer who had been unusually quiet since the dinner, had been staying in one of the locked rooms upstairs. He had always struck people as a man with many secrets, his eyes guarded, his smile always just a little too calculated. Now his door was ajar, and the room was empty save for the cold, lifeless body of Samar, sprawled on the floor in a grotesque position, his face contorted in a silent scream. The air grew thick with a different kind of terror, as the realization set in. The rhyme was not just a clue, it was a grim prophecy. 10 little strangers sat down to dine. 1 choked on poison, and then there were 9. 9. The remaining guests stood frozen, staring at Samar's body. His once strong figure now seemed fragile, broken beyond recognition. "How is this possible?" whispered Alia, her voice barely audible. She didn't dare approach the body, as though its very proximity could bring more death. "This is madness," Farouk muttered under his breath, his mind racing. The storm outside had become a distant hum compared to the storm raging inside the mansion. Every person in the room was a suspect, every glance a potential threat. "Who is doing this?" Mira's voice was strained, raw with desperation. "This doesn't make sense. We've been trapped here, yes, but how did they? How did they get to him?" And then, it happened again. The same eerie sound they'd heard the night before, the metallic creak of an old mechanism, came from somewhere deep within the house. The guests turned toward it, their eyes wide with dread. A hollow, disembodied voice echoed through the corridors. 8 little strangers, alone on the shore. 1 found a secret, and then there were 4. The words were followed by a shuddering silence, and then a sickeningly familiar sound, the soft clink of the figurines being moved. They raced to the dining room, and the terror deepened when they saw it. 1 of the 10 figurines had vanished. But more chilling than that was the sight of a bloody smear leading toward the hallway. Someone had been moving in the shadows, a predator hunting for the next victim. Betrayal was in the air now. No one was safe. They all turned on each other, accusations flying in every direction. Dr. Mira and Colonel Farouk exchanged tense words, barely masking the distrust in their voices. Alia, too afraid to speak, just clung to the edge of the table, eyes darting back and forth, desperately seeking any sign of reassurance. But none came. It was then that the truth began to surface, slowly, agonizingly. The nurse who had been with them at dinner, the one who'd served the poisoned drink, had vanished. Had they been a plant, a piece in the killer's twisted puzzle? And as they began to search the mansion, it became clear secrets were everywhere. Old hidden rooms filled with clues, strange markings on the walls, letters that none of them had noticed before. The house was alive with whispers of the past. They had all come to this place, but none of them were prepared for the horrors they would uncover. Cliffhanger ending. As the group gathered in the drawing room, a strange noise echoed from upstairs, a door creaking open. Farouk motioned for them to be silent, his hand raising in warning. They stood frozen, the fear thick around them. The storm howled louder outside, but within the house, there was only the terrifying silence of uncertainty. Then, suddenly, the door flew open, and standing in the threshold was the nurse, their missing accomplice. But she wasn't alone. She was holding something, a dark object glinting in the pale light. "I found something," she whispered, her voice trembling, "and I think it's all connected." Before she could finish, the lights flickered once more, and a gunshot rang out, echoing through the halls. But who's the next victim, and why? The midpoint, the killer's game. The night had fallen heavy over the island. The storm, relentless in its fury, had become nothing more than a distant hum in the background of their growing terror. But it was the atmosphere inside the mansion that held the true weight of their fear. The air was thick with tension, every breath a potential betrayal, every shadow a lurking threat. They were no longer guests, they were prisoners, and the walls seemed to close in with each passing hour. The discovery of the diary was both a revelation and a curse. It had been Alia who found it, hidden behind a loose brick in the library. It was an old, leather-bound book, its pages yellowed with age, as though it had been waiting to be discovered. The handwriting inside was neat, but the words were far from ordinary. At first glance, it appeared to be a personal journal, mundane entries about the author's day-to-day life. But then came the disturbing confessions. Each entry was filled with regret, guilt, and the weight of secrets kept for years. But it was the final entries that sent a cold shiver down their spines. "I never wanted it to come to this. I thought the host would be merciful, but the truth cannot be hidden. The sins I have committed, no, the sins we have all committed will be revealed, one by one. I am only the first to fall." The diary was written by none other than Imran, the quiet, reserved guest who had been the first to show signs of fear. The realization hit hard. He had been carrying the burden of guilt, but it wasn't just for the crimes he had committed. The final words painted a chilling picture. They were all connected. Each of them had something to hide, something that had tied them to the shadowy figure controlling their fate, and now it seemed the killer knew them all too well. The search for more answers quickly turned into a hunt for survival. They scoured the mansion, tearing apart every room, every nook, desperate for a lead, but each clue only led to more questions. The presence of the host, the mysterious figure they'd never seen but somehow always felt, loomed larger in their minds. Then came the third death. It happened in the dead of night, as they huddled together in the drawing room, exhausted, mentally and physically drained. The sound of a struggle echoed from the hallway, a muffled scream, a crescendo. When they rushed to the source, they found Dr. Mira lying lifeless on the cold marble floor, her throat slit so cleanly it could only have been deliberate. Her wide, glassy eyes stared up at them, unblinking, forever holding the terror of her final moments. They rushed to the body, and in the dim light, they saw something that made their blood run cold. In Dr. Mira's hand, tightly clenched, was a piece of paper, its edges stained with blood. A single sentence was scrawled in a frantic hand. "The sins of the past cannot be buried." The weight of the words hit them all at once. Mira had been the first to try to understand the diary's cryptic message, and now she was gone. The rhyme that had haunted them since the beginning had one more line to be fulfilled, but no one dared say it aloud. 7 little strangers, drowning in sin. One confessed, and then there were 6. There were only 6 left. Panic spread like wildfire as the guests tried to make sense of the killing. Was it connected to the rhyme? Were they truly being punished for their sins? If so, then who had already confessed, and who was hiding their darkest secrets? The line between friend and foe blurred with each passing moment as they realized the killer could be anyone and any of them could be next. "I told you," shouted Colonel Farouk, his voice raw with anger. "This is no random act of violence. Someone is picking us off one by one, according to the crimes we've committed." His hand shook as he pointed at them, eyes wild with desperation. "We're being punished. All of us." Alia's heart raced. But how do we stop it? If the killer's one of us, then how do we trust anyone? Her voice cracked, her eyes darting nervously to the others. Samar's voice broke through the silence. Here is only one way forward. We find out who the killer is before we become the next victim. We have to work together. But as soon as he spoke, a sinister laugh echoed through the mansion, cutting through the thick silence like a knife. It wasn't loud or maniacal. It was cold, controlled, and utterly disarming. "Work together." The voice came from everywhere and nowhere, reverberating off the walls. "You should have learned by now. Trust is a luxury none of you can afford." The guests turned in horror toward the sound, but there was no one there. No one to confront, no one to blame. Just the mocking echoes of the unseen host. Alia gasped, clutching at her chest. We can't trust anyone. The killer is playing us against each other." "Who's next?" Farouk growled, his eyes scanning the room. "Who do we trust?" And then, just as the group seemed to be on the brink of unraveling entirely, something strange happened. The figurines on the table, the same ones that had once been lined up so meticulously, were now moved in of them, now facing the opposite direction. It had been carefully placed with a purpose. Alia stepped forward, trembling as she looked at the figurine. "It's a warning," she whispered, the realization dawning on her. "Someone's making their move." The tension in the room thickened, the air growing heavy with the threat of impending doom. Everyone was a suspect now, and no one was safe. The group broke into frantic accusations, each one pointing fingers, each one trying to deflect the growing suspicion. But just as they were about to turn on each other completely, the ground shook. A loud bang echoed from above, followed by a loud thud. The lights flickered once more, casting the room into darkness. Cliffhanger ending. Then, from the darkness, a shadow moved. There, standing in the doorway, was a figure they had never seen before. Tall, cloaked in black, their face hidden behind a mask. In their hand, they held something glinting in the faint light, the final figurine. And in a low, cold voice, they whispered, "Your time is running out." Twists and turns, isolation and despair. The storm had become a living, breathing monster. Waves lashed violently against the cliffs. Thunder cracked so loudly it seemed the island might shatter into pieces, and the wind howled like 1,000 lost souls seeking refuge. The mansion, once grand and welcoming, now felt like a prison. The windows rattled, the doors creaked, and the air was suffocating with fear. Hope of escape, of rescue, was slipping through their fingers with every passing hour. Inside, the tension was unbearable. The guests, all survivors of a brutal, unfathomable game, were beginning to turn on one another. Trust had been shattered, alliances broken, and suspicion festered in the darkest corners of their minds. They were no longer individuals, but fragments of a puzzle that none of them could solve. It was then that another guest vanished. Arif, a businessman with a sharp, calculating mind, had disappeared without a trace. One moment, he had been standing in the drawing room, nervously eyeing the others, and the next, he was gone. The remaining guests searched the mansion in a frantic frenzy, but no one could find him. Hours passed, and just when they were beginning to think he had simply fled into the storm, the grim truth was revealed. It was Alia, once again the first to find the body, standing on the jagged rocks near the shoreline. The sea was merciless, crashing against the cliffs with an angry roar, but there, among the twisted wreckage of debris, lay Arif's lifeless body half submerged in the shallow waters. The expression on his face was frozen in sheer terror, his eyes wide open, still locked in the horror of his final moments. Aaliyah's breath caught in her throat, her hand trembling as she turned to the others. He didn't run away, she whispered hoarsely. He was thrown. Someone killed him, and they did it in cold blood. The realization spread like wildfire. The killer wasn't just picking them off one by one in the dark. No, this twisted mind, this puppet master, was toying with them. They were being led like lambs to the slaughter, each move calculated, each death part of a cruel game. The rhyme, that haunting nursery rhyme that had seemed so innocent at first, was no longer just a warning. It was a prophecy. 5 little strangers trapped in their lies. One dared to run, and then there were 4. 4. With Arif's death, only 4 remained. The sense of isolation grew unbearable. The storm raged outside, and inside the house felt more like a tomb with every passing minute. There was no one left to trust, no one to turn to. Despair settled in their hearts like an anchor, dragging them deeper into the abyss of their own fear. And then, as if the killer had orchestrated this moment, the fight began. It was Farouk and Samartwo, men whose nerves had been stretched thin, their tempers bubbling over in the face of mounting terror. Each accusation, each mistrust, had been building in the silence between them, until it finally erupted. The shouting started as a heated argument over who was responsible for the deaths, but it quickly turned violent. Farouk, once a stoic military man, had snapped. He lunged at Samar, his fists flying, rage and fear mingling in an uncontrollable frenzy. Samar fought back, desperate, his own fear turning to fury. Their bodies crashed against the walls, their screams filling the otherwise silent house. In a moment of chaos, it happened. Farouk's hand, wild and frantic, grabbed a heavy silver candlestick from the table. He swung it at Samar with all the strength he had left. There was a sickening thud as it connected with Samar's temple, and he collapsed to the floor, blood pooling beneath him. Silence fell, thick and suffocating. Farouk stood frozen, staring down at the lifeless body of the man he had just killed. The anger drained from his face, replaced by a sudden, terrible realization. The line between self-defense and murder had blurred, and now he too was a part of the killing game. The others stood there, eyes wide, unable to process what had just happened. No one spoke, no one moved. The gravity of the situation settled over them like a storm cloud, thick and oppressive. One more death had shattered the fragile hold they had on their sanity. 4, Alaya whispered, her voice barely audible. There are only 4 of us left, and we're running out of time. The figurines, those ominous, faceless statues that had once been arranged with such care on the dining table, had now become something else entirely. As each death occurred, one more figurine vanished, its absence another sickening reminder of how few of them remained. The last 2 figurines were still there, standing eerily silent. Would they too disappear before morning? The rhyme's grip on them was tightening. Every verse seemed to come to life with horrifying accuracy. It wasn't just a rhyme, it was a mappa blueprint of their doom. The last verse had yet to be fulfilled. 4 little strangers, desperate for peace. One fell to rage, and then there were 3. 3. Just 3 of them remained, and with each passing moment, their fear grew. The storm outside, the isolation, the deaths, the unrelenting suspense, everything was closing in on them. They were trapped, not just on the island, but in a deadly game they could not escape. Alia's heart raced as she glanced at the remaining guests. "We can't trust anyone," she whispered, her voice trembling. "We're not just playing the game, we're the game." The killer was watching them, pulling their strings, and no matter how hard they tried to resist, they were caught in the web of fate. And then, as the last figurine toppled from the table, a voice echoed from the shadow scold, calm and terrifyingly close. "You are running out of time, 3 little strangers, caught in the storm." The lights flickered, casting everything into darkness. The final verse hung in the air like a death sentence. Cliffhanger ending. In the complete silence that followed, a door creaked open somewhere in the mansion. The unmistakable sound of footsteps echoed down the hall, slow and deliberate. but there was no one there. "Who's left?" a voice whispered through the darkness. And the final figure in a faceless figure moved on its own. The final act, the last few standing. The storm had finally started to lose its ferocity, but the island remained a prison, a dark, haunted place where only a few souls were left, clinging to their lives by mere threads. The air felt thick, suffocating, with the weight of betrayal and death pressing down on the survivors. Aliyah, Farouk, and Samarth last. Three standing were no longer just strangers brought together by fate. They were enemies, survivors in a twisted, deadly game, and they each had one singular thought driving them forward: escape or die trying. Tension crackled in the air. The house, once a symbol of wealth and luxury, now felt like a tomb. They moved through its halls like shadows, eyes darting, hearts racing, as if the walls themselves might swallow them whole. It was Farouk who first found the weapon. Hidden beneath a pile of old books in a forgotten corner of the study, a cold steel gun gleamed under the dim light. His hands shook as he picked it up, feeling the weight of it, the raw power. The others stared at him, their eyes filled with a mix of fear and suspicion. No one trusted anyone anymore. "I'm innocent," Farouk spat, his voice sharp, yet laced with desperation. "I didn't kill anyone, but I sure as hell won't let any of you get the better of me. I'll do whatever it takes to get out of here." His grip tightened on the gun, his breath ragged. Aliyah stepped back, her eyes wide, heart pounding. Samar's face remained unreadable, his hands trembling at his sides. The trust between them had evaporated long ago, replaced by a gnawing suspicion that could not be ignored. "I'm not letting you kill me, Farouk," Aliyah cried, her voice a mixture of fear and anger. "You're not the only one desperate to survive." The room became a battlefield of emotions: fear, greed, desperation, and hatred. The storm outside had subsided, but inside, the battle for survival raged on. Suddenly, in the chaos, the gun went off. The sound was deafening through the mansion like the final, unrelenting strike of fate. Aliyah had tried to disarm Farouk, but the gun had gone off in the struggle. Farouk fell to the floor, clutching his chest. His eyes widened in disbelief, as if unable to comprehend the sudden, sharp pain. Blood pooled beneath him, a dark, spreading stain on the floor. His mouth opened as though to say something, but no sound came out. A few seconds passed, and then his body went still. The room fell silent once again, the air thick with the stench of death. Samar and Aliyah stood frozen, staring at the lifeless body of the man they had once feared. A part of them knew they had just witnessed something far more significant than just a man dying. It was the final unraveling of the last shred of humanity. Only two remained: Aliyah and Samar. Both of them looked at each other, the knowledge of what they had become reflected in each other's eyes. They were no longer innocent, no longer survivors by fate's hand. They were killers too. They had crossed a line they could never come back from. But before they could act, before they could even begin to think about escape, they found something that would change everything. Aliyah stumbled across a small, hidden compartment in the study's bookshelf. Inside, tucked beneath a leather-bound book, was a letter. A chilling letter that could only have been written by the one who had been orchestrating their deaths all along. She opened it with shaking hands, the words inside sinking like poison into her soul. "You have made it this far because you believe yourself innocent, but you are wrong. I chose each of you for your sins, your dark secrets, and the crimes you thought you could bury. This game has been about punishment, about making you face the darkness you have all tried to hide." Aliyah's breath caught in her throat as she read the rest, the words chilling her to the bone. The letter detailed the twisted ideology behind the killer's actions, revealing that each victim was chosen for their involvement in crimes some known, some hidden in the darkest corners of their pasts. But it was the final line that shook Aliyah to her core. "The game is almost over, and you have just one more choice to make. You both want to survive, but only one of you can. Will you kill each other, or will I decide who lives?" Suddenly, everything clicked. Aliyah stumbled across a small, hidden compartment in the study's bookshelf. Inside, tucked beneath a leather-bound book, was a letter. A chilling letter that could only have been written by the one who had been orchestrating their deaths all along. She opened it with shaking hands, the words inside sinking like poison into her soul. You have made it this far because you believe yourself innocent, but you are wrong. I chose each of you for your sins, your dark secrets, and the crimes you thought you could bury. This game has been about punishment, about making you face the darkness you have all tried to hide. Alia's breath caught in her throat as she read the rest, the words chilling her to the bone. The letter detailed the twisted ideology behind the killer's actions, revealing that each victim was chosen for their involvement in crimes some known, some hidden in the darkest corners of their pasts. But it was the final line that shook Alia to her core. The game is almost over, and you have just one more choice to make. You both want to survive, but only one of you can. Will you kill each other, or will I decide who lives? Suddenly, everything clicked. The killer was playing with them. They had always been pawns, victims of a cruel, sadistic game that had been set in motion long before they had ever set foot on this cursed island. Alia turned to Samar, the weight of the situation settling like a stone in her chest. There was no escape now. The storm outside might have passed, but the storm inside their hearts was far from over. They were the last two. The endgame was near, and it would come down to one final decision. But before Alia could speak, before she could beg for mercy or plead for answers, the floor beneath them creaked. Samar collapsed forward, his body jerking with the finality of death. His hand reached out toward Alia, his eyes wide with disbelief, as blood seeped from a wound in his chest. It had been too quick, too sudden. Alia gasped in horror, but it was too late. The sound of footsteps echoed from behind her. Her heart hammered in her chest as she slowly turned, but all she saw was darkness. The last survivor, the last one standing. Cliffhanger ending. The door to the room slammed shut, plunging her into darkness. A chilling voice echoed through the silence, cold and detached. Congratulations, Alia, you've won, but did you truly survive? The final figurine once again moved on its own, as if to whisper the final answer to the twisted game. The climax, the truth revealed. Alia stood at the entrance to the main house, the walls feeling like they were closing in on her. The storm had finally died down, and a strange stillness had settled over the island. The wind no longer howled, and the rain had softened into a quiet patter. But the quiet was unbearable. Her every step felt heavy, as though the weight of her guilt and the blood on her hands were too much to carry. She had won the game. She had survived when everyone else had fallen. But at what cost? The door creaked open, and as she stepped inside, the room before her was eerily calm. A grand chandelier hung from the ceiling, its light flickering, casting long shadows on the walls. But it was the center of the room that froze Alia's blood. A noose. Hanging from the ceiling in the center of the room, its rope swaying ever so slightly as though it had been waiting for her. Alia's heart raced, her throat tightened with panic. She had barely survived this nightmare, and yet now, the very idea of death seemed to taunt her, mocking her every breath. She was drawn to it. Step by step, against her better judgment, she moved closer to the noose, her eyes locked on it, as if it were the only thing that existed in that moment. Her guilt began to overwhelm her guilt for the people she had killed, guilt for surviving when so many others had fallen. The weight of her decisions pressed down on her, and with every step, she felt herself sinking deeper into the web of madness that had consumed the island. Alia's knees buckled, her hands trembling as she grasped the chair for support. Everything was crashing down on her. All the deaths, all the lies. The game that had seemed so random, so senseless, was not a game at all. It had been orchestrated by him, the one person she had trusted, the one person she never suspected. Samar's smile widened, his eyes glinting with a dangerous, twisted satisfaction. You really think I would let you survive, Alia? I was the one who chose you. I was the one who manipulated every move. I pulled the strings, and you danced to my tune. But you were always too weak to see the truth. Alia's mind raced. She had been a pawn in his sick game, playing along, believing she was solving a mystery. But the truth was much darker, much more sinister than she could have ever imagined. I killed them all, Samar continued, his voice low and smooth. I made sure you all suffered for the sins you thought you could bury. And now it's your turn. His words hung in the air like poison, each one sinking deeper into Alia's chest. She was trapped. There was no escape. No one would know what had really happened here. The island would consume them all, leaving nothing but death and silence in its wake. Alia's mind screamed for her to run, but she was frozen. Every instinct told her to fight back, to end this madness. But there was nothing left to fight for. She had no allies, no hope. Suddenly, Samar moved with a terrifying swiftness, reaching into his coat and pulling out a knife, the blade glinting in the dim light. Alia's heart slammed in her chest as the realization hit her with full force. She was the last one standing, but she was not safe. Samar stepped closer, the knife gleaming in his hand, the twisted smile never leaving his face. You should have known, Alia. In the end, there was never anyone else but me. His voice was low, almost mocking. Alia's breath caught in her throat as she backed away, but the door slammed shut behind her. She was trapped. And then the lights flickered. For a moment, everything went black. Cliffhanger ending. When the lights returned, Samar was gone. The noose swayed eerily in the center of the room, the only thing left in that cold, empty space. But Alia wasn't alone. A shadow moved in the corner of her eye. Her heart stopped. Another figure, someone she hadn't seen, emerged from the darkness, stepping into the light. The final twist. The killer wasn't done. The game wasn't over. It had only just begun. But as her fingers brushed the rope, a soft voice cut through the silence like a blade. Did you think it would be this simple? Alia froze, the hairs on the back of her neck standing up. Her breath hitched, and she slowly turned. From the shadows, a figure emerged, the last person she ever expected. Samar. Smile widened, his eyes glinting with a dangerous, twisted satisfaction. You really think I would let you survive, Alia? I was the one who chose you. I was the one who manipulated every move. I pulled the strings, and you danced to my tune. But you were always too weak to see the truth. Alia's mind raced. She had been a pawn in his sick game, playing along, believing she was solving a mystery. But the truth was much darker, much more sinister than she could have ever imagined. I killed them all, Samar continued, his voice low and smooth. I made sure you all suffered for the sins you thought you could bury. And now it's your turn. His words hung in the air like poison, each one sinking deeper into Alia's chest. She was trapped. There was no escape. No one would know what had really happened here. The island would consume them all, leaving nothing but death and silence in its wake. Alia's mind screamed for her to run, but she was frozen. Every instinct told her to fight back, to end this madness. But there was nothing left to fight for. She had no allies, no hope. Suddenly, Samar moved with a terrifying swiftness, reaching into his coat and pulling out a knife, the blade glinting in the dim light. Alia's heart slammed in her chest as the realization hit her with full force. She was the last one standing, but she was not safe. Samar stepped closer, the knife gleaming in his hand, the twisted smile never leaving his face. You should have known, Alia. In the end, there was never anyone else but me. His voice was low, almost mocking. Alia's breath caught in her throat as she backed away, but the door slammed shut behind her. She was trapped. And then the lights flickered. For a moment, everything went black. Cliffhanger ending. When the lights returned, Samar was gone. The noose swayed eerily in the center of the room, the only thing left in that cold, empty space. But Alaya wasn't alone. A shadow moved in the corner of her eye. Her heart stopped. Another figure, someone she hadn't seen, emerged from the darkness, stepping into the light. The final twist. The killer wasn't done. The game wasn't over. It had only just begun. The epilogue. The confession. Months passed since the island's nightmare unfolded. The storm had come and gone, and with it, the lives of all who had been caught in its deadly grip. The authorities had found nothing but a desolate island, the wreckage of broken souls and vanished hope. No survivors, no answers, just a haunting silence that seemed to permeate every inch of the place. But then, as if to mock the world that had tried to forget, a bottle washed ashore. It was tattered and worn, its edges chipped from the journey across the vast, unforgiving sea. The bottle clinked against the rocks, and as the waves lapped at the shore, it seemed almost waiting for someone to discover it. A passerby, an innocent stranger, spotted it as they walked along the coastline. Curiosity piqued. They picked it up, shaken by the weight inside. The cork popped easily, and inside, folded neatly, was a single piece of paper. Yellowed with age and worn from time, the ink was dark but elegant, deliberate. Carefully crafted words that seemed to leap off the page with an unsettling clarity. The confession. It was written by the killer. If you are reading this, then you have found my final gift. It is no coincidence, for I've carefully orchestrated every event, every twist, every turn that led us here. What you call murder, I call justice. You see, each one of those guests deserved what came to them. Their sins were hidden from the world, but not from me. I knew them all, knew their darkest secrets, their blood-stained hands that had never been held accountable. No one else could expose them, so I took it upon myself to do what was necessary. The words were chilling, methodical, and as the reader progressed, the gravity of what was revealed began to sink in. The killer was no stranger to the guests they had murdered. They had been chosen, carefully selected, for the very crimes they thought they had buried long ago. It was as if the killer had become judge, jury, and executioner, delivering punishment where the world had failed. It was a game, of course, but it was also something more. It was justice. Justice they could never escape. I watched them squirm, watched them panic, as they realized they were being hunted. Each death was a carefully calculated step, a message left for those who came after. They didn't see it at first. The rhyme, the figurines, the twisted clues, they didn't see it until it was too late. But I knew. I knew the truth before they did. As the reader continued, the confession turned darker, more haunting. The thrill, the sickening joy that came from watching each victim fall, one by one, unable to stop the inevitable. The killer reveled in the fear they had instilled, the confusion that had gripped the island. They had planned it all, the deaths, the clues, the false alliances. It had all been a performance, a game of power, and they were the puppet master. I staged my own death. You would have believed it. How could you not? But in truth, I was always watching, always waiting. I watched as you took the bait, as you danced to my tune. You thought you had solved the mystery. You thought you knew who the killer was. But it was never about who. It was about why. You'll never understand why it had to be this way, will you? The world is full of monsters hiding in plain sight, and they never face the consequences of their actions. But I gave them their due. I delivered justice, as the world has never done. The final lines were the most chilling, as the killer, in their twisted wisdom, pondered their actions with cold clarity. Was I wrong to deliver justice where the world failed? Was I wrong to become the very thing I despised, in order to make the world a better place? In the end, I wonder if you'll understand. Or will you just call me a monster, just like the others? Either way, I've done what I set out to do, and the world will never forget me. The bottle was dropped back into the sea, its message now carried far beyond the island where the horrors had taken place. The confession left nothing but a trail of questions. Who was the killer? Were they truly just an agent of justice, or had they become the very thing they sought to destroy? As the confession reached its final words, The reader was left with one question, echoing in the silence of the room. A question so haunting, so unsettling, that it lingered long after the paper was put down, long after the bottle was forgotten. Was the killer right to do what they did, or were they simply another monster, hiding behind the guise of justice? And in the stillness that followed, the answer, like the confession itself, remained as elusive as ever. Cliffhanger ending. But was the confession truly the killer's final gift? Or was there more? Something else left for the world to uncover? Something still waiting to be found in the depths of the island's forgotten corners? Who do you think is the killer? Drop your guess in the comments.